My name is Kait Chapman. I'm an extension educator of urban entomology, which is insects and their relatives. I'm based out of Lancaster County, but I also cover other counties such as Odo, Cass, Seward, and York. You can see my email right there. I generally focus on more of the urban things like bed bugs and cockroaches, but I'm happy to share a little knowledge about houseplant insects today. And then my co-host, Amy, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
So I'm Amy Timmerman. According to my slide, I'm a crop and water educator, so I'm off in my little out of my area, but that's okay. I am a rots and spots person, so I'm really happy to talk about any diseases, whether it's ornamentals or row crops. For me, for houseplants, I have none at my house, but at my office, I have a collection of cacti, which I love because I can forget to water them and it is okay.
So with the pandemic, I'm sure everyone is aware that's been going on. There's been a lot of people spending more time indoors, and as a result, sales of houseplants have increased significantly. And so a lot of people purchase or grow houseplants because they can lighten up the space. They're pretty. Sometimes they're relatively easy to take care of compared to something like a pet. But a lot of people run into a situation where an uninvited guest is either growing or feeding on their plants. So you come across a pest on your plant or a spot, and your next question is, now what? What do I do? So if you suspect that your houseplant has a pest or disease, it's important to take the proper steps to manage it before your plant is beyond saving. And that will happen sometimes where it just gets so bad that the easiest thing to do is just, pitch the plant and start from scratch. And so we promote this idea of integrated pest management, or IPM. IPM is a science-based approach that combines a variety of techniques, including biological controls, things like pesticides, purchasing plants that maybe are a little more resistant to pests or disease, mechanical traps like sticky traps, etc. The IPM process includes these 5 major steps that kind of go into this continuous cycle. The first is to identify your pest and monitor for signs and symptoms on your plant, measure the damage. For step 2, kind of evaluate what the situation is. Are you finding 1 insect on your plant or 100 insects? Is it on 1 plant, or is it a problem across all of your plants in the home? The third step is you want to use these IPM tools to try to prevent pests from coming in the first place. And then if you do have pests, you need to form an action plan that is the most effective, the least harmful, used correctly and within regulations, especially if you're dealing with pesticides. And then that last step is after you do your action plan, you need to continue to monitor, because many times you'll often see a resurgence of the pest as well. So going back to this first step in integrated pest management, you want to identify whatever pest you have on the plant in order to understand its biology, and then monitor for signs and symptoms of pests. And understanding its biology is really important, because a lot of these plant feeding insects that you'll find can be difficult to manage. So the common symptoms of pests and disease on plants include discolored leaves, like we see here on the upper left. So that's a plant that has aphids on it, and you can kind of see, I think it might be a ZZ plant, but there's kind of some yellowing on it, on the leaves. There's stunted growth and wilting. This bottom right picture is an ogre-eared jade plant that was at my house and went through a bout of mealybugs on it, and you can kind of see some of those leaves have wilted there. And these symptoms sometimes are difficult to distinguish from just general poor care, poor watering, or light, or nutrients. So it's also important to search for specific signs, including the pest itself. So there are a lot of different types of houseplant pests that you can find, thrips being one of them. Scale insects that Elizabeth mentioned earlier. We'll go over scale insects. Here's an example of scales on a plant that my colleague Jody Green had sent me these pictures. And you can kind of see on the leaf veins here, all those little yellow spots, those are scale insects. And you can kind of just generally tell from this picture that's not a healthy looking plant. The leaves also look really sticky. A lot of these sap feeding insects, their waste is called honeydew. It's kind of like a sugar water, so it makes the leaves really sticky, which can grow a mold, which can also make the plant not be able to photosynthesize as much. And then if the pest gets out of hand, it's going to start dropping leaves, and ultimately we know that's probably not a very good thing when it drops leaves. Other pests include whiteflies. So this is from one of our offices. Jody also sent me this picture. This is a plant that is dying, if not already dead, from a very severe whitefly infestation. So if we look at it close on the underside of the leaves, all of those little spots you see are whiteflies. And then whiteflies, the adults are able to fly, and so this plant is dying, and so they're trying to look for a healthy plant to continue to reproduce and feed on. So they all accumulated on this windowsill, and this, just a disclaimer, was a very heavy infestation. And usually if you get to this point, the plant is just not going to be salvageable, excuse me. There are also mealybugs, are another big one, aphids, spider mites, and fungus snaps. And you'll kind of notice a pattern of most of the ones that I mentioned. They are what we call, they fall into this sucker category. So plant feeding insects are largely grouped as sap suckers, such as this aphid you can see here. Its mouth is kind of like a straw, so it pierces into the tissue and sucks up the sap or the phloem. Or chewers, like we commonly see with caterpillars, where they actually chew up the leaf and consume the contents, and it kind of like defoliates. So you'll notice pieces of leaves or entire leaves missing. Sap-sucking insects on houseplants are often really small, and they a lot of the time go undetected until your plant starts to show some of those symptoms that I had mentioned earlier, like the yellowing or the wilting. So for the sake of time in today's presentation, I'm just going to briefly go over these bottom four, but I'm happy to answer or help answer questions about the other three that I mentioned as well. So the first one I'm going to go over are mealybugs. So these are soft-bodied insects. They're extremely small, but you notice them on the plant because they have this white powdery waxy secretion that covers their body. And this wax is really important because it actually makes it hard for pesticides to penetrate into the insect and actually kill it. So you'll notice here on the right picture is that they also have these white filaments that stick out on the sides, and it kind of almost looks like a tail at the end. It's not really a tail, but that's just one way you can helps identify mealybugs on a plant. And going back to why biology of an insect or arthropod pest is so important, mealybugs have a pretty unique life cycle. They start as eggs, and then female mealybugs will go through about 3 instars before reaching an adult. And adult female mealybugs are sessile, and they just, hang out on the plant and just eat. They don't crawl around or anything. And then the males will go to 2 to 3 instars, kind of form this false pupa, like similar to a caterpillar chrysalis, but it's not really a pupa. And then the adult males are actually really small and dark, and they have wings and can fly. But what's most important about the mealybug life cycle is that the first instars are called crawlers, and these are the active ones that, just like their name says, they can crawl around and they're going to be searching for that host plant. And then this is the stage where oftentimes if you have mealybugs on one plant, they're going to be getting to others. So the crawlers is the important life stage to try to combat. So here's an example of citrus mealybug. As I mentioned, you can kind of see that powdery wax on the mealybugs, and oftentimes you're going to find them on the plant nodes and the undersides of the leaves. And really bad infestation. They can just get absolutely everywhere. And here's my personal example of battling mealybugs. Last summer, I had purchased this plant from a local nursery. And I am the type of person where I just pick plants because I think they're pretty. And I did not take a good look at this plant before purchasing it. And a couple of weeks later, I noticed this white wax on the underside of the leaves. So I noticed that my plant was infested with mealybugs, as you can see. 6 months later, this is what my plant looks like now. I took the route of just squishing the ones I saw and didn't really care too much about what else happened. And obviously my plant, which I brought here in the office with me, is very, very sad looking now. So the mealybugs suck up that sap and it's stealing the nutrients from the plant. And as such, you can see there's a lot of wilting leaves that are falling off. The color is not great. And if you look really closely at the stem there, you can see kind of just damage from the feeding where a lot of the mealybugs had accumulated. So once again, it's important if you notice the pest on the plant, it's important to act early. So to manage mealybugs, you can wash the leaves with water, try to knock off as many as you can. That's not going to get 100% of them because like I said, they kind of hide up in the nodes and the leaves. You can also, for lower populations, you can dip a cotton swab in like rubbing alcohol and rub or squish off any mealybugs you see. The alcohol is important because it penetrates that wax on the outside of their body and it can kill them. And then if you're just completely overrun with mealybugs, you can always turn to pesticides. And data shows that pyrethrins have worked really well. And then you can also use imidacloprid, which is a systemic. You can buy them in containers and put it that go, and the insecticide gets put into the soil and the plant takes it up. They also make imidacloprid spikes that you can put into the soil, and that those have shown to kill mealybugs as well. But as I mentioned, pesticides here, it's always really important to follow the label directions and especially make sure that any pesticide you use is okay to use on houseplants and indoors. So the next insect, arguably one of my favorite insects, are aphids. So these are really small pear-shaped insects, once again with soft bodies. They have that sucking mouth part, so they drink the plant sap. The ones you find on houseplants are typically going to be green or yellow, but there are many, many different species of aphids, so they can come in all sorts of different colors. Majority of them are going to be wingless. However, you can see in the left picture that there are winged varieties, and these often come about when populations get too dense. And so they produce these winged varieties that are going to fly off and go on another plant and kind of start the population process all over again. And the right picture is just something my husband sent to me a couple years back. It kind of just shows you how small aphids can be. That's on the tip of a pen. So you really have to scour your plants and look for a lot of these pests because they're going to be pretty tiny. And so aphids reproduce really, really quickly. And so once again, this just underscores that if you notice a pest on your plant, you need to take care of it right away. So it takes about 1 week for an aphid to reach adulthood. Aphids that are indoors are not going to be laying eggs. They go through what we call parthenogenesis or asexual reproduction. So the female doesn't need to mate. She just kind of essentially produces clones of herself. And then each adult can produce 80 offspring in a week. And what's also interesting is they have what we call telescoping generation. So a female aphid that has a baby inside of her, that baby inside of her already has a baby inside of it. It's super interesting. I could talk about telescoping generations all day, but I won't. But it just like underscores like, wow, these can produce really fast. So these are some pictures of some aphid colonies that I had. Once again, aphids use sucking mouth parts, and it's going to cause wilting like we see here on these mustard plants to the left, where the plants, I mean, they're just so overrun with aphids that they're not going to be salvageable. If you look at the soybean plants on the right, I know soybeans aren't house plants, but it's just kind of a good example of the type of damage that aphids can cause. There's a lot of yellowing and the leaves look kind of sticky because they also produce honeydew. And then you see all these little dots on the leaves. Those are going to be aphids, or also you'll see a lot of these whitish calf skins, so the exoskeleton, so insects molt and will leave those skins behind. So management of aphids, you can wash plants with soapy water. So I recommend this if there are only a few aphids on the plant where they're not really overrun yet. I usually just do a spray bottle with water and detergent in it, spray it really well. It is a little difficult to find the balance of how much soapy water a plant can take versus how much is needed to kill all the insects on it. You can also use that cotton swab dipped in alcohol technique that I mentioned with mealybugs. If your plant can withstand it, you can forcefully spray water. Aphids don't stick on plants quite as well as mealybugs do, so you can knock them off. Just be wary that if they're not killed, they can crawl right back on. They're a lot more mobile than mealybugs are. And then once again, if you're just kind of desperate, you need to save the plant, there's always a pesticide option for aphids as well. Pyrethrins, there are insecticidal soaps that you can buy online or in nurseries and garden stores. Neem, horticultural oils such as neem oil or mineral oils work for aphids as well. And then once again, that imidacloprid systemic. So the next one I'm going to talk about isn't an insect. These are spider mites. And I used to work in a greenhouse, and spider mites are teeny tiny, and you will probably notice other signs and symptoms on your plant before actually seeing a mite. And that includes these little black specks or fecal specks from the mite. And then when populations get really high and they're not taken care of, you'll often see a lot of webbing, as you can see here in this picture, around the leaves as well. So these are two plants that have heavy spider mite infestations on them. So you can kind of see these plants don't look healthy at all. They also pierce leaf tissue with kind of needle-like mouth parts and feed on sap. And it creates kind of this stippled discoloration on the leaves. And it causes the leaves to drop eventually. And then also a lot of yellowing. So spider mites, you'll see a lot of overlap in the management between all of these. So you can wash the plants, but with spider mites, a lot of the time the transfer between plants happens because you're handling a plant that has spider mites. And then you go to the next plant that doesn't have it, and they're so small that you don't notice that they're on your hands or on your tools. So it's really easy to transfer. So if you know a plant has spider mites, it's important to wash your hands and tools before working on anything else. And then as far as pesticides go, generally, for spider mites, you can use those insecticidal soaps that I had mentioned. Insecticidal soap is not the same as just soapy water that I had mentioned earlier for aphids. It's an actual soap that has insecticidal properties to it. And then horticultural oils will work for spider mites as well. And spider mites are kind of difficult to take care of, so it's usually recommended to treat plants weekly or more often. But once again, if you do use a pesticide, just follow those labeled directions to take care of it. And then the last insect I'm going to be talking about, I think Jill from Tennessee, is that right, had mentioned fungus gnats. So fungus gnats are completely different from the other pests that I've mentioned. The adults are small and dark colored with clear wings. If you notice a lot of like little gnats or flies flying around your plants and you're like, where are these coming from? Those are most likely going to be fungus gnats. And then the larvae are these legless worm-like, and they have these little dark black head capsules. And the reason why they're different from the other pests I've mentioned is that because they're scavengers that feed on decaying roots. So these are roots that are already decaying, and that's often due to overwatering. And they also feed on fungi in the soil. So they rarely damage indoor plants on their own. They only ever can hurt roots of a plant that's already not doing so well. And they're just more of a nuisance because they fly around. In these photos from Jody, you can see just how tiny they are on that dime and then on her hand. And so to take care of fungus gnats, the easiest thing to do is let the soil dry as much as possible between watering without hurting your plant. And so when the soil dries, the larvae are going to die. And then to capture adults, you can use these yellow sticky traps that are pictured here. So yellow sticky traps aren't going to take care of the problem itself, but it's good to capture any adults while you're letting the soil dry. And then you can always repot with fresh soil and clean containers after thoroughly washing the plant roots to get rid of any of those larvae. Additionally, once again, if you've reached the point where you're so desperate that the drying didn't work and the sticky traps didn't work, there are what we call bio-pesticides that you can use for fungus snaps. These are soil applications that'll kill the larvae only, so you should use them in tandem with the yellow sticky cards. But the first is what we call BTI, Bacillus thuringiensis, and the subspecies. Is a type of bacteria that produces a toxin that will kill the larvae. So that can be a soil application, and these are available in nurseries or online. And then there are also beneficial nematodes that you can also apply to soil, which will kill the larvae as well. With that, I'm going to throw it over to Amy to start our disease half of the presentation.
Well, thanks, Kate. I just sent you a request to take control. All right. See if it's going to let me do it. There we go. So I'm going to start off with some basic definitions before we start talking about plant diseases. And the first one is really looking at what is a plant disease and the definition of a plant disease. And technically, it is anything. Whoop, my screen is going crazy. Thanks, Kate. It's really anything that prevents that plant from performing to its maximum potential is considered a disease. So in some ways, the insects that Kate just talked about could be considered a disease because it's preventing that plant from performing to its maximum potential. But typically when we talk about rots and spots, we're usually looking at two different forms of diseases. And so what we're looking at typically is what we call, which is a little bit of a drag, abiotic. Abiotic is those diseases caused by non-living organisms. So our common ones that we'll see in houseplants include sun scorch, as you can see in that top picture there. Those leaves turning white and the brown is just from way too much sun. Or the other big one that we run into a lot is nutrient deficiencies. I'm not going to talk about nutrient deficiencies. Last week, I know Scott talked about fertilization, but that could be a whole topic on its own, is nutrient deficiencies in houseplants, varying everything from lack of nitrogen, potassium, but also the toxicities of too much fluoride, chlorine, and salt, depending on where you're at. The ones that we usually talk about for rots and spots are those biotics. So they're caused by a living agent or a living organism. And we group that group of organisms, we usually call them pathogens. And so this includes the fungi, bacteria, nematodes, and viruses all fit into this pathogen category. It is important to know the pathogens that we see on plants, they're exactly the exact same group of pathogens that we see in humans. So they're very specific on what attacks humans and what attacks plants, but we have bacterial diseases that impacts humans, right? Like strep throat, just like we have bacterial diseases that impact plants. The other big thing I always like to reference to is the size of the pathogens to that plant cell that we're dealing with. So this is just a cartoon just to give you an idea of relative size and how small we're looking at things. So this outside edge here, that is the plant cell. So the largest organism that can attack a plant as a plant pathogen is the nematode. And so up here we have a nematode head. This isn't the whole thing. It just sticks its head in there, kind of like those aphids, and it sticks its mouth in there and it sucks out all those plant juices. Just so you know, a nematode is basically a microscopic worm per se, is what it really is. And most of these, occasionally we can see them with the naked eye, and they look like little pieces of thread in water, but most of the time we need a microscope to be able to see it. The next largest group is the fungus. So here we have a fungal structure. This is called the hypha. That is how that fungus grows from point to point. And you guys have probably seen hypha at some point in time. Usually it's that combination of hypha that we call mycelia. Sometimes it looks a lot like spider webbing that we see in there. The other things that we see with fungus is sporulation, or the spores being produced, which is either done sexually or asexually. And we'll see some pictures of that as we go through some of those common diseases we see on houseplants. The next group is Bacterium. That is that little oblong shaped little guy there. This one actually has a little flagella. So with Bacterium, we can't see individual bacteria by themselves with a microscope, with a basic light microscope. Instead, we can see a whole colony of these, and they're really favored by water movement and different components like that. And then the last group is all those tiny little dots on that screen. Those are the viruses. And the trick with viruses, we can't see these with a light microscope. We have to use a very high powerful electron microscope to be able to see these. So when we look at identification of viruses, we are doing it 100% by symptoms most of the time when we're looking at houseplants. So the other big thing when we look at diseases is it isn't a simple process. So we have what we consider the disease triangle. And what the disease triangle says, we have to have all three legs of that triangle have to meet and be of same length almost for a disease to occur. And those links include, the top one is environment. So that includes temperature, leaf wetness, relative humidity, and sometimes sunlight, all play a part in that environment. If the environment is conducive for a disease and the pathogen is there, which is the other leg of it, and we have a host or a plant that is susceptible, then we'll have disease develop. And as you can see in the middle with those three rings, where they intersect is how much disease we see. The nice thing is when we look at houseplant disease management, we can't always control our host because there isn't a lot of resistance to pathogens in houseplants, but we can sometimes remove the pathogen from the situation. Or the big one for you guys is you can control the environment, and we call that the microclimate. So whether we're looking at adjusting humidity, adjusting temperatures, those are all things that we can do in the house to control that disease development. And most of the time, we don't have to use any fungicides to actually combat the problem that we're dealing with. All right, so let's start looking at some of those common diseases that we run into. We're going to first start off with fungal leaf spots. This is a very broad category. I am going to get very specific about two of them on the next slides, but the big thing to keep in mind is there's many species of fungi that can cause leaf spots. The other big component is majority of these fungi are very specific to that plant. So in the pictures there, I may have a leaf spot on my prayer plant, and then you see below I have a picture of leaf spot on orchid. It is not very common that spot that occurs on prayer plant is going to move to orchid. So if you have multiple plant species, a lot of times they're very specific to the plant, which is very helpful for us in management process. So the symptoms of a fungal leaf spot, typically we have a tan to reddish brown to black. It's roughly a circular lesion. But as those lesions continue to grow, they can coalesce or they group together. And then all of a sudden we can have what appears to be a very irregular shaped lesion. It's no longer circular, but maybe kind of oblong or kind of blocky, just because they're merging together and forming one. As those leaf spots continue to develop, they can continue to move down that leaf, and we can end up with a full blight to that leaf. If we have it on the newest part of the plants, on those new leaves, those fungal leaf spots can get into that growing point of that plant and then kill the growing point. Otherwise, we can also see it continue to grow and spread and go on the stems and branches of the house plant. So then we get girdling of the plant and eventually death of those plants or severe leaf drop and dieback because of the fungus preventing it. So the one big thing I haven't talked about with fungi is I mentioned that they produce a spore. So in basic terms, a spore is very similar to a seed. And for that spore or seed to be able to germinate, it has to have water. And every fungal spore requires different amount of water. And so we actually have to have water sitting on that leaf surface to allow that spore to germinate and then to be able to infect that plant. And so this is really critical when we go to the next slide talking about management. So when we look at management of leaf spots, usually the best management tool is just pinching off and physically removing those leaves. If it's just one leaf, we're going to prevent the spread to the rest of the plant. And it's a really easy management tool. And talking about that leaf wetness, because we know we have to have that water on the leaf to cause the spore to germinate, we're going to look at ways to decrease that leaf wetness on it. So sometimes that's increasing air circulation. I saw in the Q&A there was a question about a Boston fir, and Scott recommended, a vaporizer. Vaporizers are wonderful, but if you're having a leaf spot issue, that's producing humidity and potential water falling on those leaves, especially if the humidifier vapor is landing directly on those leaves. And so if that's the case, we're going to want to move that humidifier so it isn't going directly on those leaves to prevent that leaf wetness. You also want to try to avoid watering the plants from above. You want to make sure you're watering at the soil line. And a lot of times, even when we move them outside during the summer for some of them, we want to water them in the morning. And that's important when we move them outside for some of those plants, is because we have natural dew points during the summer all across the country. And so if we water them in the morning, it allows the sun to dry off that leaf and less likely for that fungus to be able to sporulate and cause infection. Once again, we want as much air circulation as possible. So sometimes it's spreading out those house plants just so we can get a little bit of airflow in there. I know I've seen pictures of people that basically have a jungle in their home, which is awesome. But we have to make sure we're getting enough air movement in there. And in all reality, you rarely have to use a fungicide application to control these fungal leaf spots. We can control the environment. And once we have that environment under control, we can remove that disease altogether. So some information about a couple particular fungal disease. And the first one is powdery mildew. And the reason why I'm pulling out powdery mildew is it's probably one of the most common fungal diseases we see on houseplants, but also landscape plants also. So the trick with powdery mildew is, I already told you we need a leaf wetness, but this one doesn't like leaf wetness. It actually likes high humidity. So if you have the vaporizer running a lot, this is a good possibility you'll have this disease develop. And so this one starts off with a powdery coating on the leaf. Some people sometimes gets it confused with mealybugs, which Kait talked about. But the trick with this one is if you rub your finger across it, you can pull some of that white off and rub it off. Now, just because you're able to rub it off doesn't mean that the fungus is gone. It is still there, okay? And if we get severe infection going on, we can actually cause premature defoliation. And so as you can see on the two pictures that I have here, we have powdery mildew on a poinsettia, and I have seen full defoliation of a poinsettia due to powdery mildew. And then we also have one on Glencoe, which you wouldn't think it has such a waxy leaf surface that it wouldn't necessarily allow an opportunity for powdery mildew to develop, but it does really well. Once again, just like any of the all the other fungal ones, if I have powdery mildew developing on my poinsettia, it's not going to move to my prayer plant or the other ones. It's very host specific. So how do we manage it? Management really comes down to, once again, removing those individual leaves if we see them right away, reducing humidity whenever possible, and increasing that air circulation. There is a quick home remedy that you can use for powdery mildew. It is taking 1 teaspoon of baking soda or sodium bicarbonate and putting it in a spray bottle of water, shake it up, and then mist the leaves. The only caution I have is you need to test it on a lower leaf. Sodium bicarbonate, if you get it in too high of a concentration, and depending on the sun coming in and hitting those houseplants, we can actually burn the leaves and end up having more damage than just leaving the powdery mildew and just removing those leaves. This photo is of African violet. The powdery mildew looks a little bit different here. As you can see, it's this little flecks of white, and that is because the powdery mildew isn't necessarily growing directly on that leaf surface. It's growing more on the leaf hairs, since African violet are so fuzzy. And that's the reason why it looks like it's kind of more spotted. But once again, you could take it over there and rub your fingers right across it. The other fungal disease that we run into frequently is one called Botrytis or gray mold. This one can move very quickly if it has the right environmental conditions. And so this disease starts off with a relatively large grayish to tan lesion. Typically, we see it on the older leaves and spent flowers. This isn't one that we typically see developing on new flowers, but definitely on those spent flowers. And if you take a look at that picture of the begonia, you can see that darker coloration, that tan area. It almost looks a little wet. The big trick for identification of gray mold is it sporulates like crazy. It produces a ton of gray spores. And I guarantee you, everybody has seen this. You may have not seen it on your house plant, but that's the reason why I have that picture of that strawberry. How often do you purchase strawberries, you leave them in the fridge, and maybe you don't get them all eaten in a certain amount of time, and you have some that start to mush, and then they have that fine gray dusting on them, and that is Botrytis. Those are the spores. So that's a good way to look at it. So as the disease develops, it's going to collapse that tissue like you see up in that strawberry, but then it can also move down into the stems. And so then we can start seeing those stems also collapsing in there too. It only likes old tissue. It's not going to be affecting those new tissues. So really looking at where you're seeing it on that plant is really important. And if you're calling somebody trying to figure out, that is really key when you're talking to anybody in diagnostic. Is it on the new part or is it on the old part? For Botrytis, we need wet leaves, so lots of water, high humidities, and cool temperatures is when we're going to see a lot of Botrytis moving in. And this is one, if you do put your plants outside during the summer, this is one of those carry-on or hitchhiker type diseases, because a lot of times they're getting those spores from outside, and when you move them back inside, and we get the humidity going in the house, maybe that AC, or we keep the air temperature in the house, the thermostat down a little bit lower, we can see Botrytis starting to move in. So how do we manage this one? Just like everything else, you're going to pinch them off is the best thing, especially the spent flowers. So you can see that picture of that orchid. You see that dusting on that leaf. Picking those and pinching off those dead flowers is going to be the easiest way to manage this disease. We're also going to be looking, once again, trying to decrease leaf wetness, increase air circulation. And once again, fungicides are rarely needed as long as we can adjust that microclimate that we see going on there. All right, let's change topics a little bit. Let's talk about root and stem rots. This is probably, in general, the number one question I get in houseplants and diseases is root rots. And so what it typically ends up is sometimes it's an overwatering issue. And for these three fungal diseases, water is a big issue. So when we look at symptoms of root rot, as you can see that big picture of that poinsettia that I have in the center of the screen, typically the symptoms that we see is the plants are wilting. And once again, this ends up being a situation where people maybe continue to water it because they think it's dry. And so we keep adding more water. So once again, it's really important, stick your fingers in there, see if it's actually wet or dry. If it's wet and it's still wilting, we're going to start looking at these root rots. The other symptom that we see is yellowing of the top part of the plant first. And the reason why we see yellowing on the top part is these root and stem rots are actually plugging up the vascular system of the plant. And so the plant isn't able to move the water and the nutrients through it like it should. And so we'll see yellowing on the top part of the plant because that is the last place to get that water and nutrient. So that is a big indication that we're having a root rot issue. So the three that we're going to deal with, the only reason why I have them separated out is because the symptoms are a little bit different. But the big thing is if you're suspecting a root rot is pulling that plant out and really taking a look at those roots. So the first one on the list is called Pythium. Once again, we're going to see that stunting, yellowing, and wilting of the plant. But when you take a look at the roots, they're brown to black in coloration. And if you take a look at that picture on the bottom below that poinsettia, this is actually the roots from that poinsettia plant. And if you take a look at that main root down the middle there, going down to the bottom, and you take a really close look at it, you're going to start seeing dark brown to black spots on that root. And that isn't normal. Those roots are supposed to be a creamy white color, not dark brown. And so that's one of those indications that we have a root rot. The other thing you can do with Pythium is you can grab that root and pull it, and that outer sheath of that root will actually pull off, and then you're left with this tiny little string that is left of the root. And so that's another quick key diagnostics of Pythium. The other one that we run into is Phytophthora. Phytophthora is one that we don't like to mess with. This is one that's favored primarily by lots and lots of water, but it does move up the stem and it can cause major devastation and dieback of plants. So it causes the root tips to turn brown and mushy. And if you look at the rubber plant, which is on the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you look at the bottom where it actually, what we call it is damp off, it rotted off. And then you see that really dark lesion moving up the stem. That is the fungus moving up the stem. And so that is one key to look is on that stem and is it moving up and down. And so because of that, we're going to see pretty much complete dieback of that plant, damping off. And most of the time with Phytophthora root rot, the plants don't necessarily survive. And then the last one we deal with is Rhizoctonia. This one, when we see it on a plant, it does something a little bit different. It's a little bit drier in color. It infects those roots and stems, and it's usually a little more reddish in color, but it causes those stems to collapse. And so I've seen some aloe vera where you have that aloe vera leaf coming up in that stem, and all of a sudden you go back to that soil line, and it looks like a shrunk down piece of paper. And if it's a piece of paper, we know we're not going to get any water and movement through there. So how do we manage these? Big thing is watering, avoid excess water. The other trick is when you're transplanting and repotting those, making sure you're using clean pots. So if you're reusing pots, we really recommend that you clean and sterilize them using 10% bleach solution because those fungal spores can survive within that pot, especially if you had a plant in there that already died. We don't want to be moving that disease back and forth because the root rots are not plant specific. They are a generalist and will attack anything. I also really encourage that you avoid going outside and getting some dirt from outside because there's lots of pathogens in the dirt outside. So instead, we're going to want to be using sterile, clean potting media whenever possible. The other trick is also that potting media is important to make sure those plants are going to survive. And if we're having an issue starting to separate those plants out, especially if they're sharing any drainage trays, because if it's a Phytophthora, it's actually going to be able to move in those drainage trays. And then throw away those severely infected plants. Sorry, they're goners. There isn't a lot we can do. And if you're propagating anything, make sure you're propagating only from healthy tissue and not infected plants. And the last disease I want to talk about is viruses. There are a ton of viruses that we see in houseplants. Traditionally, some of these viruses have been kept in the plants because they give us these really cool mottled leaf appearance. So if you look at this porcelain flower up there, we got those yellow and green rings in there. This is a symptom. This is a mosaic pattern. And once upon a time, breeders were keeping these in there because it gave the leaves a really cool pattern. But we know this isn't good for the plant long term. And now we're encouraging people not to do that. So this is really important if you're propagating your own. But as you can see, we got yellow to green, mosaic patterns. We have plants that are stunted. On this Christmas cactus, you can see we have yellow rings. We can have abnormal flower coloration or abnormal formation of the flowers. And if you look at this orchid, clear on the bottom, this is tobacco mosaic virus. This one actually produces like bumps. So we might consider it, maybe it's edema, but this is erased. Once again, every virus interacts with plants differently, and this is the plant's reaction to that virus. So the symptoms are really across the board, which sometimes makes it really difficult. So how do we manage it? This is the key part. Majority of our viruses are transmitted by us. So if you are trimming up dead leaves, if you're trimming up just too much foliage, anything like that, in between plant species, we highly encourage you to wash your hands and wash your tools. So your tools, you can use like a Clorox wipe or spray 70% isopropyl alcohol on them. That way we're not spreading it from plant to plant. There are a few of these viruses that are spread by insects. So using sticky traps like Kait talked about is one way to look for those little insect pests. The other one, which is really important, is tobacco mosaic virus. Is a very common disease that we find in tobacco, and it has a wide host range. And if you are a tobacco user, whether you chew or you smoke, whenever you touch that tobacco, you can get that virus on your hands. And if you go to your houseplants, you'll transmit it to them. So if you're a tobacco user, we highly encourage that you wash your hands before you handle those plants. And if you're really interested, the tobacco mosaic virus had a huge impact on the tomato industry because it devastates tomatoes. And now tomato workers, if they are smokers, typically have to wear gloves to handle tomatoes because how easily this virus is moved. And the last thing is, if you know you have a problem, do not propagate those plants and share them with other people. It is going to cause you more headache down the road. All right. Now we are
Thanks,
on
Amy.
8.
Yeah, and just to kind of quickly wrap up things, once again, going back to the IPM wheel, prevention is super important. So before you purchase or bring any new plants inside your home, really look them over for those signs and symptoms of both pests and disease. That's where most of them come from, is purchasing new plants and you don't notice something and then suddenly it's on all of your plants in your house. Also, when you bring plants indoors, if you set them outside on your porch during the summer, just be really sure to make sure there's nothing like aphids or anything else on there before you bring them indoors. If you do notice something is infected with a disease or infested, try to isolate that plant so it doesn't transfer to other plants in your home. And then always make sure just that your plants in general have adequate water, nutrients, and light. A lot of the times plants that are lacking or just not doing well to begin with will be more susceptible if there's a disease or a pest present. So be sure that your plants are healthy because that can help them naturally fight off any pest on them as well. And then make your action plan. Is the plant even salvageable? You know, is it just near death? Are you trying to save it, or is it just easier to, you know, throw it out and grab a new plant? Are there pets or children in the home? That's especially important to consider if you're going to be spraying an insecticide or even just the sticky traps. Do you have a toddler walking around that's going to get their hair caught in a sticky trap? Just really important things to consider. How often are you going to treat? Always follow the pesticide label. If you're using a pesticide, kind of consider that in your action plan if it's going to be weekly or less often. And then if you are going to use insecticides, it's highly recommended to spray those outdoors before bringing them inside, just to limit people's exposure to that as well. And that kind of wraps up our presentation. We're happy to answer questions if there's any time left, and then I'll throw it back to you, John.
Well, thank you. We do have some questions. I think we've typed most of the answers, but I think there are a few, and I think Amy is currently typing one that I want her to answer out loud too.
Okay, I'll answer that one. I'm typing it up right now. So the question is, can we use peroxide mix to control diseases? And the answer is yes, you can use peroxide. So it is important to look at the concentration of peroxide. So the jug that you buy from Walgreens or Walmart or whatever is typically sitting about at 2 to 3% hydrogen peroxide. I still recommend that you dilute it down 1 to 10. And you, once again, just like the baking soda, you need to spot treat it because hydrogen peroxide does burn plant material. And I only recommend it as a foliar application. I usually don't recommend it as a soil drench because it's not, the hydrogen peroxide isn't going to do anything to the soil pathogens. But just so you know, hydrogen peroxide is considered an organic product used in commercial agriculture.
So for you, Kait, we've had a few questions about, I guess we could relate to the timing of applications for some of those things like scale. Like, can you control them at any time, or are there certain times that you have to control them?
Do you mean like time of day or time of year?
Or looking at what stage they might be in?
So the thing about insects that are on houseplants is they're in a controlled environment indoors. So they're not going to go through the same exact life cycle that they would be maybe on like a tree or a plant outdoors. So I would say for houseplants, really anytime if you notice a pest would be proper. So as I mentioned with the mealybugs, the crawlers, because they kind of have overlapping generations, you're not just going to have all the crawlers at once on houseplant indoors. It's kind of just going to be a continuous thing. So if you notice something on your plant, my recommendation is just as soon as you notice something, use one of those control methods. Start with the less impactful, like the washing or the swab with alcohol. And if that doesn't take care of it, then you can kind of gradually assess your pesticide options.
Wonderful answer. So we'll do one more. So we talked about, the root rots, Amy, being very common. We talked about cleaning pots. So I just wanted to mention this so that everyone hears, like, it's a good idea if you're reusing pots to clean and sanitize them. And we recommend, the easiest thing is like 1 part bleach to 9 parts water. To just do that as a dip and then let it air dry. Do you have any other thoughts on washing, cleaning, and sanitizing pots?
Sorry, my mute button disappeared on the bottom of my screen. I'm a big fan of that bleach solution. Is one of the biggest things. And scrubbing, not just rinsing, but get one of those cheap brushes that you use for dishes and scrub those pots inside before you go and reuse them and allow them to dry. The other thing you can do is the sun is your best friend. After you scrub them, sitting them outside in direct sunlight will also help kill some of those extra pathogens in there.